It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Femi Oyebode, a scholar, a psychiatrist, and a poet. Femi is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Birmingham and a consultant psychiatrist at the National Centre for Mental Health, Birmingham. In 2016, he was awarded the Royal College of Psychiatrists Lifetime Achievement Award. He's the author of Sims Symptoms in the Mind, which is the leading English language text on psychopathology, and it's been translated into Estonian, Italian, Korean, and Portuguese. He's a recognized expert in medical humanities, and he writes about the value of literature to medicine. For example, in his papers, Mind Readings, Literature and Psychiatry, and Madness at the Theatre. His talk today is going to be about solitude and inner life. I'm really looking forward to it. Many thanks for being with us today, Femi. Rupert, if we could switch over to Femi, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for your kind introduction. And I want to thank Maria as well for inviting me to take part in this conference. It's my first time of taking part in a conference that's online. And so the audience must forgive me if I take a bit of time to find my way around how to do it. It's also unusual for me to be sitting whilst I'm speaking, so I just have to get used to this new way of doing things. So today I want to talk for about 30 minutes, which will give us about 20 minutes to have questions and responses. And my topic is solitude and inner life. And I've chosen that topic, of course, in response to the theme of the conference itself, but perhaps more importantly, because of the situation that we all are facing in these COVID-19 crises that we are living through. And for a lot of people, that has meant that they've been living in lockdown. And for a lot of people that people like myself encounter in our daily clinical work, that has meant that they've been on their own. And that has created a new and different kind of experience for a lot of people. So the topic itself is quite an important topic. And I also want to say something about the medical humanities, just a kind of preamble. And it's a way of thinking, I suppose an approach, you might want to call it a method, of investigating and interrogating medical practice and the theory of medicine, in the sense that you might argue, one could argue that that medicine is become a very objective subject, that we talk all the time about blood results, scan results, and that indeed we sometimes refer to the patient in front of us as if they were just an organ, that you might say that this is a person with a liver or a spleen or something of that kind. And therefore there's been this kind of detachment from the humanity of the person that we are engaging and encountering. And this problem is a problem across the whole of medicine. It's not a problem just for mental health, it's a problem across the whole of medicine. And you could argue that the humanities, because of their very approach, the very kind of the heart of the humanities, the business of the subjective experience of the person. Therefore, the medical humanities, I suppose, is a way of trying to rectify the imbalance that has occurred in medicine in the last 100 years or so that we can start to look through the eyes of the person who's experienced disease or an affliction or something of that sort. So for today's purposes, I'm going to be using the work of a Portuguese writer, Fernando Pessoa, and I'm going to concentrate on one of his books, which is called The Book of Disquiet. And my aim is to first of all say a little bit about Fernando Pessoa himself, and say something about his importance in Portuguese literature. And then I'll concentrate on the book that I've mentioned, the Book of Disquiet. And then I will take a number of themes. So I'll start off by saying something about imagination, I'll say a little bit about the body and the self. I'm going to say something about the nature of emotions, and then I'll end by saying a little bit about the artists, and then I'll try and draw things together at the end. So Fernando Pessoa wasn't famous in his own lifetime, and he's only just gathered his fame and importance since his death. He was born in 1888 and he died in 1935. He was born in Lisbon, and his father died very suddenly when he was 5 years of age, and his mother remarried 2.5 years later, so when he was 7, and they then moved and lived in Durban in South Africa. He returned to live for a year at the age of 13 in Lisbon, and then he went back to South Africa and then returned permanently to live in Portugal in Lisbon at the age of 17. He went to the University of Lisbon for a year to study what we might call literature today, but letters in his day, but he dropped out after a year. And for the rest of his life, he made his living by translating, by working as a translator or writing letters for companies. He was a linguist, so he spoke English, which he learned when he was in Durban. He, of course, was born in Portugal, so he also spoke Portuguese, and he also spoke fluent French. So that gives an idea of his life. He's an important figure in literature because he created what he called heteronyms. And these are different from a writer writing in pseudonyms, because there are lots of writers, as we all know, who write in pseudonyms. So a pseudonym is just a name that you use for your publications. And essentially that name gives you a little bit of detachment from the word. But in Pessoa's case, these heteronyms, they were full characters. So the three major heteronyms that he wrote under, and the Portuguese-speaking people will have to forgive my pronunciation of Portuguese names. The three major ones are Alberto Cairo, Ricardo Reich, and Alvaro do Campos. And he wrote in English under the name of Alexander Serge. But we know that he wrote under well over 70 heteronyms. And we know that the three main important ones, he gave us a physical description of them. So we know that they're about the same height that he himself was in real life, and that they were clean shaven. So they're very similar to him, but they weren't all the same height. And he gave them a biography. So we know, for example, that Alberto Cairo was an untutored poet who lived in the country, and that Ricardo Reich was a doctor, and Alvaro do Campos was, in his view, was educated in Glasgow, traveled in the Orient, and lived in London for quite a while, and he was an outgoing bon vivant sort of person. So I say all of that in order to emphasize this point that for Pessoa, these heteronyms were real people, and that they had physical characteristics, and they had a biography to them. And when he wrote in their names, their poetry was very distinct from one another. So we're not talking here about a pseudonym. So we're not talking about Pessoa writing under his own, writing in his own voice, but using somebody else's name. So these authors were very, very distinct characters. And of course, a lot of people have conjectured on why Pessoa wrote in this sort of way. And I suppose we'll never, ever really know. So for today's purpose, I first of all want to emphasize that he's a major figure in Portuguese literature. He's regarded as the first modernist in Portuguese literature. I sometimes, I think of him like Disquiet. So Disquiet, the Haitian artist, he painted all the time, he drew all the time. It was as if he was compelled to draw all the time. And Pessoa is a bit like that, that he wrote when he went to a restaurant, he wrote poetry on the bills, and he'd give the name of the heteronym had written it, so that when he died, there was a suitcase that they found that had vast quantities of manuscripts in it. So his, as I've emphasized, is quite important from that point of view. So what I want to do is to use his book of Disquiet as a kind of entry point into the nature of inner life, and I suppose it exemplifies the kind of interdisciplinary theme of this conference, that we're using literature as the entry point, but you will find that I will say quite a lot about, you could argue that I'd say a bit about the nature of inner life itself and talk about it as if I were a philosopher. And you'll also find that I will say quite a number of things which you might regard as psychiatric in nature, because that's what I do for a living. And I'm a psychopathologist, so my primary interest, if you want to think of it like that, but my day job is as a person whose preoccupation is about the architecture, the boundaries, the nature of the abnormal experiences, which, if I might use the word, the abnormal phenomena that human beings experience. So that's what I spend all my time thinking about. So you wouldn't be surprised if I enter into that space as well. But the point, though, is that the literature will be the entry point, that it will be the centerpiece of the work that we're doing in this next 30 minutes or so. So I'm using the book of Disquiet, and you wouldn't be surprised that, of course, the book of Disquiet itself is not written by Pessoa. So from Pessoa's point of view, it's written by Bernardo Soares, and Pessoa, he changed his mind several times about who was the author of the book of Disquiet, and in the end, he decided that it was Bernardo Soares. That the voice in the book was closer to the voice of Fernando Soares than it was to his own Fernando Pessoa's voice. But he accepted that the book of Disquiet was a heteronym, by which he meant that it was the closest thing he'd written, which was in someone else's name, but was probably as close to himself as we could get. So it's a very revealing book in terms of the nature of the man himself. Now, we know that Pessoa was not married, was a single man, and we know that he had only one romantic relationship, which didn't last for very long. And we know that he was a shy, kind of retiring sort of person. And therefore, this book gives us a sense of what it's like to be a person who lives practically in solitude. And so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the nature of imagination. And he says, in the plausible intimacy of approaching evening, as I stand waiting for the stairs to begin at the window of this fourth floor room that looks out on the infinite, my dreams move to the rhythm required by long journeys to countries as yet unknown, or to countries that are simply hypothetical or impossible. So you've got this idea that he's either entering a fantasy world, or he's, in my preference, would be to say that he's entering an imaginary world. And this idea of an imaginary world, you might think it's a simple thing, but of course it's not. So some people want to make a distinction between fantasy as something which is undirected, that is a kind of, if you wish, an entry into one's own inner life, but in an undirected sort of way, so that you allow your thinking and your feelings to run freely. Whereas they want to use the idea of imagination as something which is directed, which is deliberate, which is under our control. And I'm happy to make that distinction. And so the idea of imagination is closer to the arts, in the sense in which the arts, by which I mean you deliberately intend to write a novel, or deliberately intend to enter into the imaginary space of writing a poem or something of that sort, or creating or composing a piece of music. So we can think of imagination in that kind of way. these matters, they're almost always best exemplified. So a good way to think of imagination is to think of us human beings, the Homo sapiens, on the plains of East Africa 200,000 years ago. And you might then think of a woman who is carrying a baby, and that baby is crying. And that woman has to imagine, put herself in that baby's shoes in order to work out whether that baby is hungry, whether that baby is uncomfortable, or whether that baby is in pain, or whether that baby is ill, or whether it's just crying. So you can start to see the function of imagination, that you're using imagination to enter into that life of that baby. Or you might think of a group of men who are hunting deer, and they're running after it, and they're three brothers, and you can see one of them might say to the other, I will run behind him, and if you go to the right, if he turns to the right, then you'll be able to spear him. So you can start to see that it also has in it this capacity to project into the future, to take the real, the concrete real, and then to, if you wish, to project it, to model it. So that's another aspect of imagination. But I want to end with the idea that imagination also has this aspect to it, which is to do with altering the nature of the real. So it counterpoints the real. So it allows us to look at the real. You write a poem about the real, and the nature of that poem influences the next person's ability to look at the world. So imagination has got that sort of feedback loop in it, which is also worth thinking about. And Pessoa in The Journey in My Mind goes on to say, in this bit of it, which he talks about the imagined future life of failure. So he says, I'll be living quietly in a little house somewhere in the suburbs, enjoying a peaceful existence, not writing the book I'm not writing now. And so as to continue not doing so, I will come up with different excuses from the ones I use now to avoid actually confronting myself. And I want to use that little quotation to talk about the time signature that is part of imagination. And time signatures are absolutely everything. So that your way of thinking of it is to say that when you pray, you might not be aware that when you're praying, essentially you're making an appeal to time, because you couldn't have a notion of praying, you couldn't have a notion of hope without a kind of aspect to it, or time signature aspect to it. And one of the things we know is that when you're low-spirited, then your capacity to imagine the future is affected. So that people, if I might say to somebody, and can you tell me how you see yourself in 5 years' time? And they'll say something like, I can only just see about every day. So you start to see that when your mind is not depressed, it has this capacity to telescope into the future. Whereas when your mind is affected by melancholia, it has this kind of foreshortened future. So the inability to project itself into the future. And that finally there's this, that if there's a kind of sense of hopelessness, or the kind of sense of morbidity, then that also acts like a filter. It acts like as if you've got a pair of glasses on that have a kind of dark filter, which means that the future it's colored, it's tinted by this idea of failure. So, and a lot of the people who I've been speaking to in this period, being on their own, and already having sense of low spirit, having a kind of sense of melancholia, one of the problems is that then gets accentuated in such a way that the capacity to project oneself into the future is then delimited. So if I go on and say a little bit about the body and the self, and of course I could talk endlessly about the body and the self, and I'm only just doing a kind of very rushed introduction and to whet your appetite and get you interested in these matters. So you can talk a little bit about the body and the self, and the kind of introduction to it from Pessoa He said, I experienced the pain of truth when I saw myself there, because inevitably it was my face I looked at first. I have never had a very high opinion of my physical appearance, but never before have I felt such a non-entity as I did then, comparing myself with the other faces so familiar to me in that lineup of my daily companions. I look rather like a dull Jesuit. My thin, inexpressive face betrays no intelligence, no intensity, nothing whatever to make it stand out from the stagnant tide of the other faces. And here I want to say something about how the inner self, the kind of sense of low self-esteem, a kind of low self-worth, gets manifest in the way in which a person starts to feel about their bodies. And so I mean, sometimes we think that it's the physical, objective appearance of the face, of the body, that makes a person feel low. I suppose what I'm trying to suggest this morning is that the reverse is true, which is that if a person has a low sense of self, the body itself starts to be perceived as if it were ugly in comparison to other people's bodies. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to make a diversion to Kafka. And Kafka's letters are absolutely wonderful. So Kafka's letters to Felix Bauer are incredible. And the letter to father is also quite an extraordinary piece of document to look at. And in the letter to Felix Bauer, to whom he was engaged for a while, he wrote, it is certain that a major obstacle to my progress is my physical condition. Nothing can be accomplished with such a body. My body is too long for its weakness. It hasn't the least bit of fat to engender a blessed warmth, to preserve an inner fire, no fat on which the spirit would occasionally nourish itself beyond its daily need without damage to the whole. How shall the weak heart that lately has troubled me so often be able to pound the blood through all the lengths of these legs? So you can start to see a kind of feeling that he doesn't feel particularly proud of his body. In Kafka's case, even the writing itself, and my purpose today is not to demonstrate and confirm that and give evidence for it. I just state it as an assertion. Even the writing itself, the sparseness, the pared down, kind of very, very punctilious, kind of very the concision of the writing is itself a manifestation of the thinness of his body that Kafka himself, Franz Kafka himself, sees. To proceed, so that's looking at the body. What I want to now do is talk a little bit about the self. And he says, this is Pessoa, he says, today suddenly I reached an absurd but unerring conclusion. In a moment of enlightenment, I realized that I'm nobody, absolutely nobody. When the lightning flashed, I saw that what I thought to be a city was in fact a deserted plain. And in the same sinister light that revealed me to myself, there seemed to be no sky above it. I was robbed of any possibility of having existed before the world. If I was reincarnated, I must have done so without myself, without a self to reincarnate. So you got this very powerful sense of not being anyone at all. And I want to bring that back to this business of solitude, of being in lockdown during COVID-19, that the interactions with other people, that our sense of self, that the plurality of the self, of the inner self, that the richness of the inner self is in response to the world. It's in response to as much to the physical world, because we're even though we're humans and we're social animals, we're still responding. So when you go for a walk and you're in the park and you look at the magnificence of the spring and the trees flowering, that itself says something to the inner self. And there's a richness that comes out of that. There's a kind of blossoming in the same way that the flowers are blossoming. There's a blossoming in the inner self. But of course, we're humans, we're social animals. So there's an aspect of our interaction with others, which itself is enlivening. It is incredibly vitalizing and so on. So this kind of feeling of being a nobody, because we are getting praise and we are getting feedback for the most trivial of accomplishments. And that itself restokes the fire in us. And he goes on to say that we are all of us slaves of external circumstances. This is still Pessoa speaking. Even at a table in some backstreet cafe, a sunny day can open before us visions of wide fields. A shadow over the countryside can cause us to shrink inside ourselves, seeking uneasy shelter in the dullest house that is ourselves. And even in the midst of daytime things, the arrival of darkness can open out like a slowly spreading fan, a deep awareness of our need for rest. So I've already made the point that the lack of contact, that the kind of solitude can itself, if you wish, devitalize the inner self, and that's one of the problems that we're facing at present. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just say one more thing about this business of inner self and the nature of the body and how it relates to it and so on. And Pessoa talks about monotony, and he says one must monotonize existence in order to rid it of monotony. One must make the everyday so anodyne that the slightest incident proves entertaining. In the midst of my day-to-day work, dull, repetitive, and pointless, visions of escape surface in me, vestiges of dreams of far-off islands, parties held in avenues of gardens in some other age, different landscapes, different feelings, a different me. But between balance sheets, I realized that if I had it all, none of it would be mine. So you've got this idea, it's a complex idea that he's getting at, this idea that routines matter. And that monotony is very important because it's within that kind of bleak gray landscape that we have a kind of the incidents that are pleasurable. If you're thinking of the reward principle, if you're thinking, you think as a neurochemist might think, as a psychopharmacologist might think, that you're thinking of the reward systems, that is there something that stands out, that makes us, we notice something that stands out in the background of a grayness. And that's what he's getting at, that monotony is important and routines are important. And for my purposes for this morning, the point I want to make is, of course, that one of the greatest problems at the beginning of lockdown in this newly kind of created, enforced exile in solitude is this matter that we had to recreate a monotony. So I was used to waking up at a particular time, getting dressed, catching the bus, catching the train, taking the last walk of about half a mile into my work. And then the day was organized for me very schematically. And then I suddenly discovered that I had none of those external controls, none of those kind of routinized ways of working. And it took a while to recreate my own, to enforce a kind of routine, a kind of monotony in myself in order to be able to do the work that was necessary. And I think that's what Pessoa is talking about there. I want to, I will very, very briefly, I'm not going to expand on it, say a little bit about, because I've talked so much, but I haven't said anything at all about emotional life, because I've talked about inner life as if there's no emotions involved in it. And so I'm just going to read this out. I'm not sure that I need to expand on it. And he says there are some deep-seated griefs so subtle and pervasive that it is difficult to grasp whether they belong to our soul or to our body, whether they come from a single malaise brought on by pondering on the futility of life, or whether they are caused rather by indisposition in some chasm within ourselves, the stomach, the liver, or the brain. How often my ordinary consciousness of myself is obscured by the dark sediment stirred up in some stagnant part of me. How often existence wounds me to the point that I feel a nausea so indefinable that I can't tell if it's just tedium or an indication that I'm actually about to be sick. My soul today is sad to the very marrow of its bones. Everything hurts me. Memory, eyes, arms. It's like having rheumatism in every part of my being. The limpid brightness of the day, the great pure blue sky, the steady tide of diffused light, none of this touches my being. I remain unmoved by the light autumnal breeze that still bears the trace of an unforgotten summer and lends color to the air. Nothing means anything to me. So you've got this incredible, wonderful description of what it is like to have what we call in our trade anhedonia. So anhedonia is just a nice word which just speaks to hedonism. It talks to about pleasure, and we just put the word "an" in front of it to say you're unable to experience pleasure. And you've got that, and some people think that is the central core feature of a depressive disorder. And you've got a magnificent description of it by Pessoa. I want to end by talking about the artist, because of course, not everything about solitude is negative. And I indicated at the beginning that of course it releases the capacity to have imagination. And so I want to end with the artist. And I want to start off by talking about Borges, George Louis Borges. And he said of Shakespeare, and of course he's imagining Shakespeare, but he said of Shakespeare, he says there's no one in him besides his face and his words, which were copious, fantastic and stormy. There was only a bit of coldness, a dream dreamt by no one. No one has ever been so many men as this man, who like the Egyptian Proteus could exhaust all the guises of reality. And he imagines that when Shakespeare goes to meet God, that Shakespeare will say to God, I who have been so many men want to be one and myself. So there's this idea that the writer or the composer or the artist, that in making these magnificent works, which are then externalized, that the capacity to make these external pieces of work requires the individual to be able to enter into the life of everybody else. And in order to do that, that perhaps, this is a perhaps of course, that perhaps they have to be emptied themselves of themselves. And of course, you can see straight away why this is relevant in respect of Pessoa, who, as far as we know, had over 70 heteronyms. And he himself says, by going deeper into myself, I became many. The tiniest episode, a change in the light, the trembling fall of a dry leaf, the petal that withers and drops from the flower, the voice on the other side of the wall, or the footsteps of the person who speaks, together with those of the person I presume to be listening, the half-open gate to the old form, the inner courtyard that opens through an archway into the houses huddled in the moonlight, all these things, none of which belongs to me, bind up my sensitive thoughts with knots of plangent longing. I am someone else in each of these moments. I painfully renew myself in each ill-defined impression. I live off impressions that are not mine, prodigal in renunciations, always other in the way I am myself. So you see that there's a kind of a wonder in the experience, in the inner life of solitude itself, when it is anchored to creativity, when it's anchored to the desire and the deliberate intention to create something anew, to do something novel and original. And that in the doing of that, you're calling on the resources that we have as humans, that we started off with the whole business of the imagination, the capacity to enter into the other. So that even for a composer, a musician, to be able to write the music, they have to be able to enter into the inner life of another person to imagine how they would hear it. And in order to do that, you're creating this multiplicity of the self inside oneself. Of course, we're not doing with as much kind of richness and plurality as Pessoa has done. So to draw things to a close, I hope that I've introduced this idea of what the inner life is, to give a sort of sense of what it is like, to give a sense of the architecture of the inner life, and to say something about the distinction between the subjective, which is what inner life is, what we would say we would call it, the subjective in inner space, in comparison, in distinction to the external objective space, which is what we all inhabit. And I hope that I've used Pessoa, a wonderful, wonderful writer, as a kind of light, a kind of torch to shine into that inner space, to give us a sense of what it's like in there. And thank you very much for listening.
Many, many thanks indeed, Femi. That was fantastic. So interesting to shift from this, the world of this writer to the inner life, to our current situation in the pandemic. There are lots of questions, of course, in the chat, which I'm going to read to you. We may not get through all of them. Many apologies to anyone whose question gets missed, but it will stay in the chat through this morning, so it can kind of be read by all of us and be part of the conversation. But I'm going to try to rush through as many questions as possible in this final 20 minutes, if that's okay with you, Femi. Yes. So I'm going to start, great, thank you so much. So I'm going to start with a question from jumpfly4org, who's curious to know what you think about when a story arrives in the mind. Where does it come from? As it sometimes feels like it comes from somewhere other than the mind. Like Pessoa's 3 characters, were they from his mind or were they from somewhere else?
Well, I can only say, because I'm a biologist, so I don't think there's anything outside of the physical structures that we inhabit. Therefore, we have to say that they're coming from within him. And of course, I appreciate that some writers talk about, and even Pessoa himself talks about, as if he were just like an automata who was just writing as if he was being instructed or being dictated to. So I take that point. But I'm not of the belief that there's anything outside of what we know. There's nothing outside physics, in other words.
Thank you very much. The next question's from Kathy Jayakumar. Hi Femi, she says, would you say that the main character in the book of Disquiet is a visionary on the human condition? And what can we then learn from him?
The character Suarez, in the author of so if we follow strictly what Pessoa is saying, the Suarez, I think Suarez very, very similar to Kafka. So these are people, they're early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. They're in a particular period in European culture, European civilization. You have got the Industrial Revolution, the degree to which people were moving from the agricultural life into the major cities, the kind of destruction of the kind of relationships with other people, the kind of atomization, the anonymity of cities, all that sort of stuff. So a lot of this writing, and there's no doubt at all, of course, that sort of writing goes right through into post-war periods. So that kind of writing is Jean-Paul Sartre is still writing like that. Camus, Albert Camus himself is writing like that. So a lot of the existentialism, a lot of existential writing is in that vein. So I don't know what a visionary is. I think they're just, their inner life is reflecting some aspect of the if you want to think of it, the kind of, I don't want to use the word destruction, but the kind of destruction of what would have been the life that us humans had lived for 170,000 years. And the Industrial Revolution essentially ripped that apart. And you've got these new men, you know, and kind of the new man, which is what we're inhabiting at present. And I think they're just expressing it. They're capturing it in words.
Thank you, thanks. My next question is from Clive Sherlock, and he'd like to ask what you think about the fact that imagination and fantasy might not be under the control of the thinker, not like the driver of a car, which can go anywhere, but like a train driver on a track. Authors, like composers, don't know what will happen next and be surprised by it, and then be excited in anticipation to learn what's going to happen. So I wondered if you had some reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, I take the point that's been made, and so Kekule, you know, the Kekule was a Japanese chemist who discovered the structure, you know, the structure of benzene rings, you know, and he tried to work out what the benzene ring looked like, and he worked and worked on it, and then he went to bed, and then he dreamt about the snake that was eating its own tail. So that's a long-winded way of saying that nobody's arguing that the human mind is linear. And nobody's arguing that you have to deliberately intend to solve a problem before you're able to solve it. But I suppose all I just say is, yeah, I take the point that empirically speaking, you can find yourself writing something that's unexpected. Even more interestingly, you can write something or compose something and then read it and can't believe that you wrote it. you know, so I take that empirically speaking, that's correct. But all that, in my way of looking at the world, all that is telling us is that there's a lot of work to be done to understand the nature of the human brain, how it works.
Thank you, thank you. The next question is from Niran Okewole, and it's, what are your thoughts on Pessoa's heteronyms in relation to dissociation and dissociative identity? And I'm really glad that Niran's asked this question, because I was going to take chair's privilege and ask that if I could. So what's your thoughts in relation to Pessoa's heteronyms and dissociation and dissociative identity?
Yeah, so if we use if I use an old-fashioned term, so we talk about multiple personality disorder. So that's a nice old-fashioned term because it speaks to the issue properly. So a multiple personality disorder is a person, a real person, and the disorder is that the person then has multiple selves, or that they're multiple persons, or more accurately, multiple persona in them. And technically speaking, not all the personas are aware of one another, so that's important to say, and also important that there is no control. So you haven't got. So it's not as if you've got a homunculus who's choosing to be Jane today and tomorrow Eliza. You know, so that person, they become overwhelmed by this persona. Of course, multiple personality disorder, technically, conceptually, challenges everything that we know about the nature of the self, because normally when you're thinking of the self, you're thinking there are particular characteristics that we use to define the self, and one of them is unity of the self, another is vitality of the self. And then we talk there about the agency of the self, and then we talk about the boundaries of the self. So the unity of the self, the proposition there is that we are unified in ourselves, that we don't expect to find cracks in us. So you can see straight away, in the way of answering that question, that Pessoa doesn't have a multiple personality disorder, because Pessoa, he is consciously, deliberately, with full intention, creating a given biography to characters, who he then enters into them. And he is, in my view, is a wonderful, wonderful poet who ought to have been a playwright. You know, because that's what playwrights do. You know, so Ibsen said that when I first get the character, I know them as if I've just met them on the bus. I then come to know them as if they're my acquaintances. And by the time I'm ready to write about them, I then know them as if they're members of my family. But of course, the plays that Ibsen wrote, the segment that we know of those plays is, from Ibsen's point of view, is a tiny little proportion of the full life of the character, which is also wonderful to think of. And I think Pessoa is a poet who is actually inhabiting the kind of imaginative space that playwrights do.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Tope Saladin Adegoke, from Nigeria. My question is on imagination. It seems it's the avenue through which we can experience the inarticulate pains of others. The metaphor of a mother who must put herself in the mind of her infant is so apt. But then again, imagination can't be tamed. It can be so can't be tamed. It can be so conforming that it blurs reality. In the case of a writer, how does he strike a balance between imagination and reality for the sake of his mental health?
It's a complex, very, very complex question I've been asked. So, and I was going to say a little bit about empathy. And because that's what that question is speaking to. That question is speaking to the nature of empathy and speaking to the idea that to be a writer or to be an artist, you have to have empathy, the capacity to enter the world of another. And I was going to say something about that in order to undo what people normally think. So for example, we know that mirror neurons exist, you know, so mirror neurons are in macaque monkeys. So a macaque monkey's brain, when another monkey moves an arm like that, the macaque monkey's brain, in their brain, they also get a movement like that. So what we learn from that is that in order to know what another animal is doing, it's not just that we see them do it, but we recreate it, we mirror it in our own brains, in our own bodies, in order to know what they're doing. So I thought that's an interesting thing to think of. Now, what we didn't know before, which we only come to know more recently, is that in order for me to be able to imagine you, I have to map my own body first. So I have to know where my arms are, where my forehead is, and where my limbs are. Because when I'm going to map you onto my body, in order to know whether you're unhappy, because I watch you, your body is like that, which tells me you're unhappy. But in order to know you're unhappy, I have to map your body onto mine so that my body then moves like that in my brain. And then I decode that to say what it means. All right, so absolutely wonderful to imagine that what we thought was psychological, by which we mean mental, by which we mean it's abstract, to then to imagine that that is actually very embodied, you know, that it's, you know, it's to do with the physical body. So that's quite important to think of. So, but the issue that's been asked, which is a very, very important question for a psychiatrist or for a psychologist who works with people, is this idea that are we liable to being exhausted? Are we, is there a possibility for compassion fatigue? And can the writer have compassion fatigue? By which I mean, can he have empathy fatigue? So that when he enters into the world of another, can that exhaust the writer? And there are some people who say that that's true. So if you look at the writers, and you look at the rates of suicide in writers, and you look at the rates of alcohol dependence and misuse in writers, massive. But we don't know what comes before what. And Pessoa, when he died young. He died from cirrhosis of the liver, which tells us he was drinking heavily. All right, so I take the point that's been made, which is an important question about the degree to which the going back into oneself in order to relieve particular kinds of emotions, whether that's exhausting, whether it can be corrupting to the spirit. If you're writing about nasty people, can that affect your own moral judgment and all this sort of stuff? So these are legitimate questions, and I suppose every writer, every artist comes to find their own ways of controlling it, but not everybody succeeds in how they manage it.
Thank you, thanks. I'm aware that I'm rather undemocratically just rolling down the chat, picking up questions as I go. So I'm just going to ask my colleague Maria, if you see a question that you think we really must get Femi to answer further down, then please do just interrupt. But for now, I'm just going to go straight on to Vine Mandagari's question, which is a lovely one. Do you have any personal recommendations of novels or poetry and literature for an aspiring psychiatrist? This could take some time.
Well, every novel is, you know, so when I talk about mood disturbance, I usually talk about autobiographical narratives. I talk about memoirs. Kay Redfield Jamieson's Unquiet Minds, a wonderful, wonderful account of her bipolar disorder. She's a professor at Johns Hopkins herself, and studies bipolar disorders, and she herself has it, and she has wonderful, wonderful descriptions of it. J.S. Mill, the moral philosopher himself, suffered from depression, and he has exquisite descriptions of what it is like in his, it's just called An Autobiography, so that's worth reading. Janet Frame, Janet Frame is a New Zealand poet and novelist who has passed away sadly. And Faces in the Water his autobiographical novel. And of course, if I did any of that and didn't say anything at all about Sylvia Plath, everybody would think I didn't know what I was doing. So Sylvia Plath is a bell jar, is worth reading. But of course, I read Sylvia Plath. I read her poems as well as her novel, and then Anne Sexton's is exquisite poetry, trying to understand what it feels like to be low-spirited. So that's a good way of thinking of it, is to think of the phenomena that you are interested in, and then try to see, what might illustrate them better.
Thank you, that makes a huge amount of sense. My next question is from Murray Allett. Throughout this lockdown period, we've seen increases in anxiety, and I've noticed suggestions of agoraphobia, either already or fear of this going forward. The quotation you mentioned, "a shadow can cause us to shrink inside ourselves," made me think of this as also. Do you see suggestions of agoraphobia in these texts, or its relationship to solitude?
Not really, because of course they're not in forced exile. You know what I mean? So, so he's writing. And he does go out and he does work. But he's like a lot of writers, is like a shy, kind of introverted type person. Therefore, he gives us a kind of entry point to trying to understand what it is like to be fearful of what the world might hold. But it's a wonderful question you've asked, because I was thinking before, last night, I was thinking of the word dread and trying to work out what dread is, and trying to understand what's the difference between dread and apprehension. And apprehension says precisely what it is, that it is apprehending, that it is anticipating a feared situation. Whereas a dread also has that in it, but it has what the Germans would call an angst in it. So it's got that kind of feeling as if your throat is being squeezed, and you've got at the pit of your tummy this incredible knot in it. So it's got anxiety in it, but there are shades of melancholy in it as well. So I agree that for a lot of people, this inability to go out and to be stuck in the same space has not been good. That is just essentially accentuated and exacerbated aspects of what they would normally have had, but it exacerbated because there's no way of getting out of it.
Thank you. So next, Jean Power says, "Thank you for your brilliant mind and for your compassionate heart today. How fortunate for your clients. I was interested in the part on imagination, altering the nature of the real. Could you please share more about that?" And Jean's an art psychotherapist in Ireland.
Well, I think that so if you're reading a novel, and you identify with a character in the novel, and that character has a problem that they're solving, and you see how they've gone about solving it, then that influences your capacity yourself to solve it. But you may not know that you're doing that. Or if you're reading poetry, for example, and you've never looked at rhododendron in the spring yourself in the particular light, and when somebody writes about it, you lift your head up and you suddenly see it, and you might have thought that that particular flower was red, and then the person says it's magenta, and then you look at it again, and then you recognize that there are shades of red, So the real and the fictional are always intertwined, and I usually want to tell the story of Reagan, who said when there was a problem it was in Venezuela, I forget which country it was, in South America, where he said, "We'll just have to send Rambo," and he meant it. He meant it. It wasn't a joke. And that is the interpenetration of the fictional world in a kind of exposed situation of the fictional world into the real. But that's happening all the time. It's happening all the time. So it's just inevitable. And that's, you know, who was it that myths live their lives through men? You know, and they do. They're doing that all the time. You know, the storylines, they're just living their lives through us all the time. So the myths and the tiny little fragments of storytelling that we carry in our heads function. William Carlos Williams calls it the word machine. And what he meant by it is that you got these little fragments and they work like a machine and they alter your thinking, and they do.
Thank you. I'm aware we've just got 2 minutes coming up to the break, okay. So I'm just going to take Maria. Yes.
I just wondered if you could ask a question that has come a little bit later.
Of course.
I'm thinking about how enriching all this discussion is and how much useful I think it would be for mental health practice. And so there is a question from Joy that very much speaks also to my own sort of question, which is, she says, I wonder if you're seeing a significant shift in the approach to medical humanities within healthcare, education and practice. And I will then withdraw and leave it to you to finish off.
I'm not sure that there's been, I mean, there in the USA, there's been because of the way medical education is run in the US, because it's a postgraduate degree. So and a lot of people come into medicine in America haven't done a liberal arts degree. Therefore, the Americans, for probably 30 years or more, have taken the humanities far much more seriously than we have in Europe. And so we're like late starters, and we now have people who do a first degree can come and do medicine as a postgraduate degree, and some of them, not all of them, and not a majority of them, some of them come either with the humanities degrees or come with class 6 or something of that sort, and therefore that's a change in our system. I've run for about 15 years, a bachelor's degree, intercalated degree in psychological medicine, where a compulsory module is on the arts and the literature and psychiatry, which have run very, very popular. It's the most popular intercalated degree in Birmingham. But that is for a small select group of people who want to take a year out of medicine to get a bachelor's degree outside of medicine. And so they're selected, there are about 15 to 20 of them, depending on how many we can take that year and so on. But there, as far as I know, there are no really thoroughgoing, properly integrated medical humanities degrees in Britain. There's the inroad, of course, is in ethics. So medical ethics has been a kind of stable kind of part of British medicine, probably for about 30 years or so.
Many thanks. There are so many more questions and really interesting ones, which is a testimony to just how interesting and stimulating that talk was. But we are going to have to try and keep to time today. So many apologies to people whose questions didn't get answered. They'll stay in the chat so people can see them. And there is, of course, the opportunity for a smaller group discussion this afternoon where these questions may come up. I just wanted to say thank you again, Femi, for an incredibly stimulating talk and answering all those questions so eloquently, and I think I'm going to clap for real rather than do an emoji. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.